I've set out to answer the question, who's the greatest running back of all time? Typically, this comes down to a three-man conversation, but there are some who argue there's a fourth running back who ought to be included. I happen to agree, so I wondered, who else has a claim to at least be mentioned in the GOAT conversation? To sort it out, I've put together a comparative analysis featured in this GOAT running back video series. Welcome to Volume 3. If you haven't seen Volumes 1 or 2 yet, please do. Volume 1 starts off with the background and methodology for this analysis in a section called the Primer. Then it tells us who's the most accomplished running back of all time. After that, Volume 2 showed us the running back with the greatest longevity. The links for those videos are in the description. Now getting into Volume 3, here's a quick synopsis of how this all works. I'm assessing these 40 running backs using these 5 categories with data and information from here and game film from there, with careers that fall in line with this time boundary, using about 115 different stats, a few custom analytics, and hundreds of hours of game film from across more than 6 decades. No highlights were used in the making of this analysis. And I'm following these rules of engagement. These are broken down in more detail in Volume 2, Longevity. Make sure you watch it. That said, here we go with the analysis for performance. This is my favorite category. It's because I came up with a custom analytic for overall player efficiency. The idea is similar to PER in basketball, or adjusted net yards per attempt for quarterbacks. Metrics, data management, and stats are all in my wheelhouse from my day job, so I got pretty geeked out about putting this together. I needed to have something more complete, more than just yards per carry, yards per game, etc. Those are essential to be sure, but there's much more to it. Which leads me to the criteria. As I alluded to already, performance has to do with individual player efficiency on a per-game basis across a career peak. In this context, career peak is the most productive seasons for each running back as the primary starter, up to 9. There are some caveats to this. As stated in the accomplishments video, I only assessed backs with at least 5 seasons as the primary starter. That's the minimum. The maximum for the career peak follows Jim Brown's career of 9 seasons as a benchmark. He was peak the whole time, with MVPs and rushing titles in both his first and last seasons. To be part of the all-time great conversation, you have to have a career peak that approaches that standard. This also means running backs with 10-plus seasons who had down years in the twilight of their career won't be penalized by factoring in those off years. Likewise, seasons that were derailed by issues with management or injuries will be set aside in favor of each back's best seasons, again up to 9. Ultimately, there are 2 reasons that a season may be excluded. Reason number 1, there are enough seasons in the running back's career enabling off years to be set aside. A good example of this is Pittsburgh Steelers great Franco Harris. He played 13 seasons, which means I could exclude 1973, his second year in the league. There was an unfortunate coaching decision that season to use him more as a blocking back, even though he earned Rookie of the Year the season before. On top of that, he was put on rotation starting in only 8 games. Fortunately, that situation was corrected. The following season, he was back at the helm, and the Steelers went on to win their first of 4 Super Bowls that decade. But the point is, we can see that 1973 was clearly off-peak, and thus not included. The same goes for some of the waning years near the end of his career. Reason number 2 for excluding a season from the career peak is that a running back simply wasn't listed as the primary starter for enough seasons. Some backs had fewer seasons in their career peak due to injury or other circumstances. Case in point is Marshawn Lynch. He was in the league for 12 years, but there are several seasons where his usage was down or he simply wasn't listed as the primary starter. Looking at the numbers, during his 3rd year with Buffalo, his usage as the starter was notably down. He had roughly half the number of starts as Fred Jackson and about half the carries and less than half the yardage. We see this again in 2015. That year he ended up on the short end for starts, attempts, yardage, and touchdowns. In total, he has only 8 seasons with the most starts and the most touches amongst running backs on his teams. With this in mind, his career peak is limited to 8 seasons. I also need to point out, even though 2010 was affected by a mid-season trade to the Seahawks, it's included in his career peak because he had the most starts and touches of all Seattle running backs that year, and there aren't enough seasons to swap out for that one. That's the approach used for honing each running back's career peak, especially for those with less than 9 seasons. Sorry for the complexity, but this is the transparency I intend to keep. I want to make sure that the methodology is understood. You don't have to agree. I just want to assure understanding. Next, I've mentioned the term player efficiency several times, so I have to clarify what that means. It factors in yardage, scoring, and play volume, meaning carries, receptions, and passing attempts. Then subtracts the effect of turnovers with the whole thing adjusted for availability. Based on this, we calculate what I affectionately call offensive production score. The name of this metric includes the word score, which implies points. So, I've taken the point values for touchdowns and 2-point conversions, pretty straightforward, and added them to the point values for plays, yardage, fumbles, and interceptions. Not so straightforward. So you ask, what are the point values for those things? Well, I have an answer for that. They're derived from the statistical model established in the book titled The Hidden Game of Football, written by Peter Palmer and Bob Carroll, published in 1988, and from a collection of papers called Statistical Thinking in Sports, edited by Jim Albert and Ruud Koning. I think I'm pronouncing that right. This was published in 2019. Using their model, I compiled the offensive production score for each back. For a little more insight into how this works, here's a snippet from Statistical Thinking in Sports created by sports economist David J. Berry. Data was collected for 8 NFL seasons to develop these coefficients. This is about to get a little wonky, so if you're afraid of heights, feel free to skip ahead to the analysis. The point value of a yard is 0.08. For plays, note the negative value of negative 0.214. That means there's a statistical cost for running a play. A team needs to make up that cost in yardage or by scoring in order to be successful. Breaking out some old school algebra, a team needs X number of yards on a given play to offset the cost of that play. Basically, the two values need to add up to at least 0. You with me so far? So, we plug in the values, then solve for X. Just another step or two. We need to get the X by itself. You remember this stuff, right? And boom, a team needs to gain around 2.675 yards to make the play worth it. This makes sense because 2.675 yards times 4 plays, if your analytics tells you to go for it on 4th down, gets you 10.7 yards. So that's approximately what you need for a first down. The point of all of this is to show that the derivation of these coefficients is statistically sound and validated by real-world data. There's a bit of variance between the raw data set and the pure math, that extra 0.7 in the results, but that's a very workable margin of error. So, this model is the best I could come up with for assessing performance. Basically, what I'm saying is, you can trust me. Just go with it. At least I'm not masking the variables or equations in my metric. Oh, and there's a cost of turnovers, so we can factor in ball security as well. All of this is to explain how I'm using their model to build the formula for offensive production score. Next, I put the team games in the denominator. This factors in availability so we can see how a running back's performance, in effect, supported their team throughout the season, accounting for games missed from injuries, holdouts, etc. The custom analytic then becomes effective offensive production score per game, giving us our performance metric. And like I said, I really geeked out about this one. And finally, to calculate the overall performance rating, I took the average of the effective offensive production score per game from across each running back's career peak, whatever length it turned out to be it 5 or 9 seasons or somewhere in between. Now, if you have any questions or concerns about any of this, have at it in the comments section. I really do want feedback. Doesn't mean I'll do anything with it, but maybe this will be that YouTube comment section that's packed full of thoughtful insights. Maybe. Anyway, it's time for the number crunching. Here's the top 10 backs for the category. I see a few familiar names as well as some unexpected results. This leads to some interesting takeaways. There's 11 through 25 and 26 through 40. Next step is to cover why individual performance matters for the GOAT debate. Seems like a no-brainer really, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. As I touched on earlier, we're considering all aspects of measurable performance, including play volume, rushing, receiving, passing, scoring, ball security, and availability. It provides a perspective of each running back's individual results as a basis for direct comparison. And it factors in usage as well as consistency to account for offensive schemes that centered around the running back, or didn't. Right off the bat, we can see that Jim Brown was an absolute force of nature. He had excellent efficiency sustained across his entire career. While he didn't have the highest single season peak, that belongs to LaDainian Tomlinson, Brown did consistently deliver the highest level of efficiency, providing Cleveland with perhaps the most reliable offensive weapon ever. He could be counted on every season to be the center of the offensive scheme. This is also the reason he fared so well in longevity despite only playing 9 seasons. He delivered value in the form of touchdowns, play volume, and yardage, coming from rushing, receiving, as well as passing. He even threw 3 touchdown passes during his career. It might be noted that he never achieved a 2,000-yard season. This could seem like a blot on his performance compared to several other all-time greats, but it must be noted that he had the second highest yards per game in a season ever in 1963. He attained 133 yards per game, which was topped only by O.J. Simpson during his 1973 record-setting season, which was 143 yards per game. Brown hit that 133-yard mark in a 14-game season, totaling over 1,800 yards. This performance tracks out across a more modern 16-game season, though we are on to 17 games and maybe 18 soon. But for 16 games, this is 2,130 yards. That happens to be greater than Eric Dickerson's single-season record of 2,105 yards. Dickerson attained that record in 1984, which was a 16-game season. So, while Brown never actually hit the 2,000-yard mark, he's in the mix with those running backs who have. As a matter of fact, 1958 was a 12-game season in which he delivered the per-game efficiency of 127 yards per game, equaling yet another 2,000-yard season, if projected across 16 games. Only he and O.J. did this twice with the efficiency of over 125 yards per game needed to hit the 2,000-yard mark in a 16-game season. He's also one of only 5 running backs in NFL history to rush for over 130 yards per game in a season. Considering both Brown's dominant performance rating and his top-level all-time efficiency stats in yards per game, TDs per game, and yards per carry, for which he's ranked first all-time among running backs with at least 5 seasons as the primary starter, it's clear that he is by far the most efficient running back of all time. In the second spot for performance is LaDainian Tomlinson. A big driver of his performance here is that he has the highest single-season performance rating of all time. Along with that, he had a few other top-rated seasons. There were also a few low-rated performances on the bookends of his career peak, but the nosebleed efficiency of his record-setting 2006 season, with 31 touchdowns, pulls his overall average up quite a bit. Not to mention the fact that he has the most seasons, with 4, in the top 25 for individual efficiency ratings. It must be noted that his prolific results in the passing game played no small part in these results. The offensive production score model includes all forms of offensive yardage, where receiving in particular is a very efficient means of moving the ball down the field. To this end, LT accumulated about 26% of his total yards from pass catching. This turns out to be a big boon to his overall performance rating, and for a little extra, he has the second most touchdown passes by a running back in the Super Bowl era, with 7, just 1 behind Walter Payton. On top of that, I have to add, he's just one of 3 running backs, also in this era, along with Christian McCaffrey and again Walter Payton, to have a rushing, receiving, and passing touchdown all in the same game. Now that is a performance. Building on the comments made regarding LT, there are several other accomplished receiving backs that rose to the top of the performance category. Priest Holmes, Marshall Faulk, and Lenny Moore fill in the remaining top 5 spots behind Brown and Tomlinson. Their receiving production had a meaningful part to play in the rankings. Holmes gained 26% of his total career yards from receptions, while Faulk reached the 36% mark, having been a key part of the greatest show on turf during the 99 to 2001 seasons. By contrast, backs like Payton, Smith, and Sanders had 21%, 16%, and 15% of their total yards coming from receiving. This led to them ending up a little bit lower on the ratings. But it's Lenny Moore who got the most from this aspect, having gained about 54% of his total career yards from receiving the ball. His yards per touch was particularly high, the highest of anyone listed in this video, and by a lot. Comparing his per down stats to Jim Brown's, you can see that Lenny's stratospheric career peak receiving efficiency of 17.3 yards per reception lifted his overall per touch results significantly. On top of that, his total career stat of 16.6 yards per reception is higher than some of the greatest wide receivers of all time, namely Hall of Famers Jerry Rice, Terrell Owens, Calvin Johnson, Randy Moss, you name it. Bottom line, the passing game played a big part in these players having the highest performance ratings among everyone in the analysis. This happens to be aligned with the model that we see today regarding prolific receiving backs like Austin Eckler, Christian McCaffrey, and Alvin Kamara. These guys have racked up a high percentage of their yardage from pass catching. Interestingly, that's how it used to be long before the Super Bowl era, with legendary running backs from the 50s like Frank Gifford, Ollie Madsen, and Hugh McElhenney. To further the point, The old school guys also shared the backfield in a running back by committee type of format, much like we see today. It makes me wonder, are we coming full circle? What's old is new again? Well, except for the helmets, I suppose. There it is, the tally and takeaways for performance. There were a few surprises for me as I put this together, especially seeing how receiving yards impacted the results, elevating a number of players. Additionally, it's interesting to consider how the role of the running back has changed over the years and is actually realigning with some facets from the distant past, namely the role in the passing game. Can we learn anything more about today's game based on how things played out back then? Maybe that's something I'll try to explore in future videos, but for the present, what we do know, Jim Brown had the most efficient performance of any running back in NFL history, says me. Okay, 3 videos down, 2 to go, and the next one is Volume 4, Impact. That video breaks down how each player's individual performance impacted their team's success. Team strength, the relative strength of opponents, the running back's offensive load, and the resulting win-loss record all come into play for that one. I think you'll find this one interesting. Make sure you join me. And remember, like, subscribe, share the video, comment, let me know what you think.